Grand Touring Concepts, we have a special viewer's request. This one comes from user Machine Gun, who mentioned in the comments on one of our videos that he wanted to know how to strip, clean, and then do the base setup on a Lada carburetor. Right. Shawn's got one, and we're going to take it apart, give you an overview of how it works, how to clean it up, because this one's pretty grimy, and then how to do base setup on your own Lada.
We have a carb here that we're going to strip down, clean up, rebuild, and do some settings on. It was in the back of my 2104 when I bought it. The original guy I bought it from said that it was off his 86 2104 he had previous. If it's off of that, I really don't know. But we'll clean her up to see what it's like. The carb that we have here is kind of traditionally known as a Weber style carb. There's a couple different types. This one is what's known as a vacuum or mechanical secondary carb. And you can tell that because it doesn't have a big vacuum port right here. And on the back side, if you start to run the throttle, you run and you'll manually open up the second carb. The other ones, you do this. This one here stays closed until vacuum, when the engine's running, will pull it open as it needs. It's an on-demand carburetor. The first step that we're going to do here is take off all the little ancillary bits. Just going to take all the little pieces off so we can clean everything up before we start on the main body. If you're worried that you'll forget where they go, just take a camera or your phone or whatever, take a picture of where everything sits, then you have a reference for putting it back together. More pictures the better, helps with reassembly. We have the carb stripped down to its base components. We have all the accessory bits off. This piece right here comes with that, and the little spring is your accelerator pump. What that does is as you initially step onto the throttle, it'll moves a little diaphragm, gives a little squirt of fuel to richen it up so that once the throttle's open, you can start to accelerate before vacuum gets there to pull more fuel in. It is what prevents a stumble when you're on the throttle. This piece here is your choke vacuum pull-off. All it does is when you're on the throttle, if you still have your choke stuck on, as there's a bit of a demand, the vacuum will go through, pull on a little diaphragm, moves this here, and it pulls the choke off so it doesn't stay engaged. That's just your choke holder, your choke cable holder, sorry. This here is your float for inside your float bowl, as well as your seat for inside your float bowl. This just hooks on here, it sits in, and that's what sets your fuel level in your float. As it goes, if you have too much fuel, it'll lift up and it will pull the seat away, let fuel come in. As it gets too much, it goes the other way, chokes off the little hole, no more fuel comes in. That's how it regulates how much fuel goes in the carburetor. Other than that, we have your base plate, which has your throttle linkage and everything in it, as well as your adjustment screws and some of your vacuum tubes. You have your main body, which has your initial squirter hole for your accelerator pump, You have idle jets, and then you have your main jets. That's the jetting size for your idle. If, depending on where you live for elevation, you'll have different size jets to keep it within its normal range. And there's your main jets. That's the jets that it runs off if you're on wide open throttle. That controls how much fuel can get into the engine. Right there is where your accelerator pump goes. Other than that, not really a whole lot to it. There's your diffusers in there and your venturis, which create the vacuum to pull everything through. And then you have your top hat. And that's where your fuel comes in. It's where your float hangs off of. And it's also where your choke blade is. There's not a whole lot to these things. They're not rocket science. They're actually very easily to service and take care of. While pulling apart the small parts, I have found this. This here is that vacuum choke pull-off I was talking about, which sits in like this. And if you look closely here, there's a little metal ring that sort of stands out. That is meant to go and seal this rubber off and keep pressure on it. But if you look right here, when it was installed, it actually wasn't in place and sitting. And it was actually, looks like it was leaking because it didn't have proper sealing. And you can even see the tail of it right there. So right from factory, this wasn't sealed up properly. The choke pull-off would never have worked right on this carburetor. We have our initial cleaning done. We are now going to get into a more detailed cleaning. Now before we go into that, this carb was quite clean before we started. It didn't have a lot of gunk on it. And this is still what come out of it. Real dirty, black, a lot of crud. But they're usually much worse, so we got lucky there. But in our more detailed teardown, we have to remove the air idle screw, clean that up and blow air through and make sure that the port is not blocked. If it's blocked, you wouldn't be able to get any adjustment and this whole rebuild would be for nothing. So it's quite simple. You take your screwdriver and what you're going to do is you're going to actually turn the screw in first. And the reason why we're going to do that is so that you have a base setting of where to put the screw again when you go to set the carb up for running it. Usually the rule of thumb is 2.5 to 3.5 turns from bottom out is where most carbs run being set up. But not all of them. We're going to see right now where this one's at. We're at the half, 1, half, 2, and a half, and almost 3, so 2 3/4, which is right in that range of where most carbs set up on your idle screw. Keep that number in your head or write it down wherever you need to know. Now we're going to wind it out and then blow air through it to make sure the passage is clear. Here's our screw. You just wind it out till it comes free. It will come out pretty hard. There's an O-ring in there that'll kind of hold it. But there's your adjustment screw. Make sure that that is not bent, not tweaked, that everything is good. If it looks in bad shape, look at replacing it. We'll reach down inside with a pick, and there's an O-ring down in there, which as you can see, this one is destroyed. It's got a chunk out of it, it's all tore up. These should come in a full carburetor rebuild kit. You will get a new O-ring. Make sure you check that. This will completely change how that car runs. Make sure you blow air through. Make sure air is coming out of the little holes. You can kind of see them down in there. That's the little guy is your bleed hole. And that's where that screw adjusts. Yep, she's all cleared out. We feel air coming through it. So we move on to the next step. We have our main body here for our carburetor. And I'm going to point out what the jets do and what all the little pieces of this are. Firstly, right here we have our fuel cutoff. You have power going to this so that with power to it, it keeps a little valve in here open and lets fuel go to our primary barrel. On a normal Weber style, this would be a jet that you could use to actually change and fine tune. This one, they don't have that. You have to do all your adjustment through your adjustment screw. And right in down in here, if you can see, is our main jet for primary, main jet for secondary. There's our main air corrector and our secondary air corrector. The main jet down here is used for your last 20% of throttle. Your idle screw and through this circuit here where your primary jet or primary idle jet would be is used for the first 80% of your throttle. After that, your main jet here takes over. Up here is the air corrector. What these do is you adjust these by taking them out using bigger or smaller to fine-tune your lean or your enrichment on this individual barrel, and you can adjust each barrel side to side. Over here, they also have a secondary idle screw which you can change out and use, but is not used much. That's only used again for the first 80% of your secondary engagement. And on one of these, your secondary doesn't engage till you're 2/3 into your throttle. We're going to pull these out, we're going to see what size they are, mark them down, measure them, and again blow air through all these passageways and make sure that everything flows and it's not plugged. So if you're taking these out, pull the numbers off them as you go, write them down on a sheet of paper, write down where they go so you can replace them where they come from.
So this is the main jet removed, and you can take a look down through the orifice and you can see that it's nice and clean. Then to locate the part number off it, or the jet size, you roll to the side and you take a look right here. So this one is a 130 jet. This is the secondary jet. And again, nice and clean, no occlusions in the bore. And this one is slightly larger. You'll see that this one is stamped clearly with a 140. So that will provide more fuel at wide open throttle when that secondary barrel opens. We've also been able to remove the emulsion tube. And as you can see, this one has a series of perforations all around it for fuel control, and you'll notice that there's quite a bit of crud on this one. So these all need to be cleaned up. Cleaning the emulsion tubes is pretty straightforward. You can either get yourself a dedicated kit like this with a various selection of bore cleaners, or you can use appropriately sized drill bits, but it's very important to get it clean, but not to oversize the bores in. Failing that, an appropriate safety pin or anything at all, just nice and smooth to clean out any crud or corrosion that happens to be in there.
You see doing that, the crud blowing out of there. All cleaned, good to go. Now that everything's clean, we're going to start reassembling the jets into the carb so we can put this thing together. First thing you do is you take your emulsion tubes. These are both labeled F15s. Some carbs will have offset sizes, like a F17 one side, or F15 the other. Make sure they go in the right spot. Where they're both the same size, it doesn't really matter. But always make sure things go back where they are supposed to go. You just slide down in the holes like so. Your air corrector jet goes back down in, holds them in, and make sure again that the right size goes for the right side. These are both the same, so it doesn't matter. And we just screw them in. When using a small screwdriver like this, do not put any tension on these. I'm just using this one for getting them initially set up. If you use the wrong size screwdriver, you can actually break them. You have to make sure you use a big one that fits the width of the slot. That way you can get enough pressure on each one so you don't tear it apart. And you just want to go basically snug. You don't want to go too much because they are brass. They will destroy and be damaged. A lot like that one was. You can see where it's been galled up. Someone used the wrong screwdriver when installing them sometime. Now these are what go in next. They go down inside the little hole down in there. This one is the 130, so that goes in the primary. If you got big fingers, they are not easy to get in place. And they're even harder to get started and not cross thread. And that is the 140, that goes in the secondary. And the same thing again, don't over tighten them too much or you'll break a chunk off like you've seen on that other screw. And that's your primary and your secondary main jets installed. Now we're going to put this back in. This is your auxiliary pump squirter. This is what gives that initial little shot of fuel when the diaphragm is compressed. And that just goes back in on top. Everything sits down in and it threads in place. And again, nice big screwdriver that fits in so you can tighten it up without binding and galling anything up. And now we're ready to put this piece now down onto the base plate. I have the main body inverted upside down so that we can start putting gaskets together to reassemble the base plate onto it. These go in only one spot in a very specific way. They have to go down over these little brass nipples so that everything lines up. It all only goes one way. You can't put them on backwards or mess it up. If you do, it's because you weren't paying attention. Once you get all three of these together, you take your main base and you set her down over, and it should pretty much fall right together like that. Take your screws, put them into your base, and wind them in. These just kind of help hold it together for initial installation. Once you put it all together and bolt it to the intake manifold, that handles the rest of the clamping of the base. Next step for assembly, we have it in the vise. This is a no-no, don't ever do it. It's just lightly clamped. If you put too much pressure, you could actually warp the base, destroy the carburetor. Don't do it. But with that said, we are now going to install accelerator pump. With a full carb kit, you would have a new accelerator pump. We don't have one. Again, this is mostly for video. So they go together in a couple steps. You have your big spring, goes and sits into that little trough there. Then you have your pump, and you have your body. You put that just like that so that it sits together. This whole piece goes down on top of the spring, and this sits right against there. Then while holding all of this and not dropping anything, you have to put screws in, line it all up, and get them started. And this carb will wind up with a new accelerator pump and all the other pieces later on. This will be used for a future part of the project. You don't want to get too tight on these either. Just good and snug is just fine. It's only aluminum. Doesn't have a whole lot of resistance to tearing. Do that, and then as you get on your throttle, it moves here and it pushes that little lever, which moves the diaphragm, and that gives a squirt of fuel into the carburetor. Now we're going to start assembling all the little throttle linkage pieces, which is the most painful part of this job, just because it's fiddly. So you have your little tie bar that hooks down into this one. You have that set kind of like that. Next step is you take your spring, you put her down over, line it up with a little hole. Then you take your tie bar, you have to spin it around, get it to hook into the one certain spot that it'll go. Then you can move it. You bring it over top, hook that spring in there, shove the whole works down onto that. Then use your big screw here to go in over it, and it'll hold that piece on. And that's the main chunk of our linkage in place. There's some more linkage that has to hook up yet, but we will cover that when we get there. And now, as you move it, everything's clear. And all this linkage does is this for your choke. When you pull your choke on, as you pull it, you see it just slightly moves your primary. And that's what gives you your high idle. Next step on this, we're going to put together the vacuum pull-off for the choke. You have your main base piece, you have your secondary piece, your little diaphragm dealie, and the chunk of linkage and some screws. Again, you would use a new one of these, but we don't have it. So it just sort of slides down in place. It can only go in the one spot. Then you take this, it can only go in the one spot. And this is, as you remember, we were talking about how it wasn't really mated up and leaking, but for this video that don't matter. Put your screws in and just tighten them up. We have the choke pull off assembled, and then we have a linkage we're going to put in it, and then we're going to mount it to the carb. Normally, you see this little spigot here, there's an O-ring that sits in here. The O-ring is torn, we don't have one, so we'll just show you how to put it together without. Next up, you have your linkage. It's a very specific thing that only goes one way. So put her down through like that and let her pull up so that this plastic washer is on the outside. Once you have that, lift it up into place. There's a little trough. You can turn it. Now you can put it in the spot, put the screws in, and go. The holes in this aluminum are not fully cleaned out from machining, so you have to thread them in the whole way instead of them just sliding down in place. Mildly annoying. And again, you don't want to tighten them up too much, just snug them up good. Next step, we're going to put the float back in place with the needle seat. It's a very simple system, comprised of a float, your little needle as we talked about. It sits down in here, and this is of course the top of the carb, and it will sit like that. And with the fuel, this rises and falls, and as it does, it pulls this float or little needle in and out, and that limits how much fuel can get into the carburetor. Hook this into the little tab there, and hang it and not lose it. Get it down in the hole, and then we have a brass pin that comes in from this side through that holds it, and then it gets to get lined up with the other hole, and there we are. And as you see now, if you come to the side, as this moves up and down, that's what limits how much fuel can come in and out of the bowl. And it's also got a little bitty spring on it so that it doesn't get too much. And that's what is basically, this is a fuel pressure regulator for the manual pump. Remember everything I just told you about the float. You do that, but first you put the gasket in place. This sits below the float and there's no cutout to get down past that. So it's quite easy. Quickly comes apart. That goes down on like that. Then put it back together, brass pin. And back together we go. Now it can go together. We are now going to take and put the top part of the carburetor in place. You have yourself like this, turn it upside down, make sure that nothing falls out. Do your best to keep the gasket lined up. Set your float down in the little trough. Then move that there, line everything up, and it kind of sits in place. And we will cover hooking that up after I get some screws in and get that settled in place. Again, why they didn't just run these holes out a little bit, then the screws could drop in instead of having to be threaded the whole way. On the linkage side of the carburetor here, we have this one spring left to hook up, and this hooks directly into the choke to help spring pull it off. This here you take, it's two pieces. You have to pull this main body back, slide it into the trough, as well as washer not be in the way. So just kind of hold that with your finger, pull this all back, then feed it in, so it's like that. When you get it right, this will slide down inside and lock, and now that can't come out. That took me probably 4 tries last time I tried to do that. They are difficult. One more thing to do. This little spring here hooks into that return and goes over the post. And that's part of the pull off. Other than that, you just have this, which is your choke cable holder, and the carburetor is rebuilt and pretty much ready to go. With it all assembled and put back together, the next thing you want to do is go over the entire carb, make sure all your screws are all tight, all your linkages are hooked up, springs in place, and that everything moves and operates as it should. Once you have everything checked, make sure and you know it's all good, and then you want to do your base setups. This screw here, basically leave it alone. That is more of an emissions adjustment than it is anything else, so don't worry too much about that. That there is your main idle screw. You want to take that, set it to wherever your carb was before, as long as it's within your 2 to 3.5 turns. If it's not, set it, wind it all the way in and back it out so that it's about 2.5. Half, 1, half, 2.5. That gives you an initial base setting for starting your car up and see if it'll run, and then you can adjust as needed, which that'll be covered in something else entirely. After that, the only other screw you have to really adjust is your idle screw here. Once you have your mixture screw set and that's all set where you want, then you can adjust where your car idles by twisting or turning that one. And that's more just by RPM, nothing else.
So that should give you a really quick overview on how to take apart the Lada Weber style carburetor, give it a cleaning, change the gaskets, and redo your base setup for putting it back on the car and just getting it running. Now the actual tuning and calibration of the carburetor is a whole other topic, which we'll have to cover in another video, just because the length, duration, and to be honest, Shawn's carb on his Lada kind of works. And when you get something working,
we're not messing with it.
You don't want to break it.
No.
But we'll cover that probably later on in the year.
Back when we put that carb that we just rebuilt on the car, but I've got to get more pieces for it yet. All the other little bits that we said we didn't have, all have to go in it before that one goes on the car, and we're going to try to adjust it up. And we'll cover that in the video.
Sure, because that's a mechanical secondary carb, which is really attractive for a future part of the project.
Absolutely.
Compared to the vacuum secondary carburetor, which gives kind of nice drivability, but we're kind of looking for power.
Yeah.
So stay tuned for that in the future. Machine Gun Joe, or Machine Gun, hopefully that answers your question, gets you set on your way to degunking your own carburetor and getting it going. Another item is you'll notice Shawn is wearing an IVAN2104 shirt. If that's something you're interested in, put that in the comments below the video or on our Facebook page. Let us know some feedback. We might put those into production, start distributing them to any fans who are interested in a little bit of t-shirt or some show swag. Additionally, we've also launched gtconcepts.ca, which is our website. You can go on there, find your links to the Facebook page, and they'll also be posted below this video, where we have blog posts and articles from current projects, past projects, photos, and really an overview of everything we've got going on beyond what we post on Facebook, which is kind of a very limited, narrow...
Yeah, there's a lot more going on than what is shown in video, just because we've been doing it for 15 years now, so there's a lot of old content that we're trying to cover.
Yeah, stuff that we're trying to get back out into the public, things that used to be featured on forums, or some articles and tech that just never seen the light of day for whatever reason. So,
as well as previous cars that are no longer with us, been kind of destroyed, some crushed, a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and for instance, our 1993 Lada Niva project that we had previous to the IVAN2104 project, we're covering that there. I'm digging up a little bit of archive video, as well as we had quite a long technical series with that. So those articles will be posted and rolled out in due time. So stay tuned for that. Like, share, subscribe, and thanks for watching.
Later.